Hello, 205 class. I had a couple things I wanted to talk to you about. Um, just two. And one is really excellent, and the other one is just about um, an assignment. So for some of you, that'll be excellent. It should be a fun assignment. And, for some of you, it'll just be okay. And that's fine. Okay, so the first thing that I wanted to talk to you about is homework 2. Um, I hope this is a fun assignment, fun and exciting assignment. I think is where I was trying to go with that. You're choosing any disorder that we have talked about, that we will talk about, or any speech and hearing related disorder that we don't even cover in this class. There are too many for us to cover, frankly. I mean, misophonia is a really interesting disorder. It's a hearing related disorder, and we don't cover it at all. But it's but I would love to, and maybe in the future I will. But we're not covering it this semester. So if you're interested in that, I mean, that could be a topic that you dive into. Or anything else. If you want to go further into ASD, go ahead. If you want to go further into fluency disorders, that's excellent. Anything we have talked about, anything we will talk about in the future of the class, and also anything related that we don't cover. You can send Lexi and me an email if you're not sure if your topic fits. But, it's a quick thing. We'll either say that that's acceptable or not. And usually people know what topics are good for this kind of assignment and not. So I'm sure that you'll judge it well. So I'm going to post a video that goes further in depth on this in just a few minutes after this one's posted. But I do want to really quickly talk about APA format. You're going to use APA format for homework 2. APA, it stands for the American Psychological Association. But essentially they got together and came up with this way that papers are written. And it is the standard across all the sciences. You probably have learned MLA in probably high school, and maybe some of your English 101 and 102 classes here at ASU. It's similar. APA is similar to MLA, but it's not the same. The reason why there's a difference is because MLA is usually not citing sources in the same way that APA is. And APA also reports things like an abstract differently. Instead of a summary, it's got an abstract, and the references list are different. But because the sciences, which speech and hearing is a part of, use APA, I want you to know APA now so that you're not astounded by it later. Especially when you enter your master's program, you're going to be expected to write a lot of papers, usually a paper at the end of every class, in lieu of a final sort of thing that uses APA format. So this is your first introduction to it, maybe, at least in this major. So one thing about APA is that you need to cite every paper that's in your reference list in the actual paper. So I'm asking you to look for a certain number of papers. 8 is what comes to my mind, although I'm absolutely sure that 8 is for the final homework 3. Double check on that. Like, go with the rubric for the number of sources I'm asking you to have. I think it's 8, but anyway. So you're going to have a certain number of papers that I'm asking you to have in your reference list. You have to cite all those in your paper. So you can't have things that are in the reference like, well, I read this and I know some things from it and I'm writing this paper. You have to cite everything that you learned from somewhere. So any fact that isn't just something that is generally known needs a citation. So you have to cite every paper that's going to be in your reference list in the body of the paper. It's a one-to-one correlation, right? So if you have a citation in the paper, it's in the reference list. If it's in the reference list, it's in the paper. Simple. Also, I can be one of your references. So you can use me or a guest lecturer or the book as one of your references. So that doesn't mean that you get 3, like you use me and a guest lecturer and the book. No. Those would be 1. So you get to choose one of those 3 to be one of your references, but that's okay. Now the other thing is, if you looked at the rubric already, I've said that you have to use sources from 2013 to the present. And I'm getting rid of that because you may be in a position where you want to go with some older research on the topic. Let's say autism. You'd like to cite some papers from the 90s because you're talking about what autism is. And you can't do that if I'm telling you to cite papers only from 2013. A lot of papers from 2013 will just say like, autism is this, and then they'll cite a paper from the 90s. They don't have to talk about it because if you're curious, you'll go back to that original paper and read it. So then you won't have anything to cite if you're trying to get a good reference for the introduction of the topic. So I'm getting rid of that requirement. It probably still says it in the rubric right now, but I'm going to delete it later today. Okay, so the other thing is there is kind of a hack built into the APA format. And the hack that's built into the APA format is the abstract. The abstract is essentially a very miniature version of the entire paper. It's got a little bit of the introduction. It has got the methods in there. It's got the results and the discussion. So if you read the abstract, you kind of know exactly what's going to be in the paper. It's not like an introduction to it. Nothing is left to be a surprise. The major findings are all in the abstract. Or they should be in a good abstract. That doesn't mean you're always going to be reading a good abstract. Not everybody writes a good abstract. But most things will have a good abstract. So anyway, what you can do is save yourself some time and grief by reading the abstracts first. You're going to have a certain number of papers. I want you to think of a disorder that is really interesting to you. This should be a fun assignment because it's based on your interest. If you're not really into the hearing stuff, but you're really into like disfluencies, go with disfluencies. Sorry. And just dig into that. So do like whatever interests you. It should be, cool. It should be fun. But even within an area that interests you, there can be some papers that are like real duds. There can be papers that don't exactly pertain to the topic that you're looking at. And what I don't want you to get into is you've decided to pull 5 papers and you start reading them and you're like 2 or 3 pages in and they don't really work. So now you've wasted time reading that. Don't do that. Read the abstract first. That will let you know if it's a good paper to choose or not. So you can skim the abstract really quickly. If it doesn't work, move on. Go to the next article. So choose good articles just by skimming the abstract. Once you have the articles you want, do read the rest of the paper. Don't just go with the abstract. You need to actually see what's going on there. The abstract is so short that sometimes not all the findings can be summarized in the abstract, so there is still a reason to read the actual paper. But it's a really good way to like kind of sift through and see if it's worth reading for your research. Okay, and then lastly, I want you to end with a falsifiable question. The falsifiable question, of course, is one that can be answered with a yes or no. And so you can't, like, let's say again, you're looking at ASD and your question could be, it shouldn't be, but you could put this, will we ever be able to cure autism? It's not really a falsifiable question because, it is set up so that we could give it a yes or no answer, but no one who's alive right now could give you an intelligible yes or no answer because we don't know. And so it's not a good question. The kind of question that you want is something that if I gave you money and a lab, you could answer it right now. You know, it's just something that hasn't been researched yet that you're curious about. So let's say that you're reading a paper and it shows that one thing we know about people with autism is that tactile stimulation works really well. So let's say you take kind of a behaviorist slant to language, and you say that language is learned because we get rewards from it. If I can say cookie, then it's more likely that I will get a cookie rather than just being like crying, you know, like a baby just cries, and we have to decide, did they poop themselves? Are they hungry? Are they just crying for no reason? So if you can use language to say, I want a cookie, or I have pooped myself, or whatever, then you can get that taken care of much more quickly. So we take this stance, and then we also take into account that people with autism enjoy deep pressure stimulation. So what we do is, sorry, my phone's ringing. Okay. So what we do is we start teaching them language, and it's still ringing. And we reinforce it with deep pressure stimulation. Teach them pragmatics. People with autism, of course, know language. It requires, for this, you'd be looking at those people that are almost locked in if you're teaching them language. And then for the people who know language just fine, maybe we're talking about pragmatics. So you're trying to help them learn pragmatics, and you can do this by pairing correct responses with deep pressure stimulation. And maybe your question is, could deep pressure stimulation therapy aid in teaching people with autism about pragmatics? And that could be a thing. Like if I gave you money, you could find people with autism and you could design the study, and you could actually see if that worked out. You can hypothesize about areas of the brain with an fMRI or an EEG. You don't have to know how to use it, but it could be something that we could answer within the realm of possibility. So that's a good falsifiable question. And I will post a sample paper for you guys to take a look at that has a great like introduction, a great dive into the topic, and a good falsifiable question. So you'll actually be able to see like what gets 100%, right? So there should be no question left in your mind once you look at that, hopefully. Okay, now on to the good news. Exam 1, the average score is an 81, which is excellent. There are quite a few, there's not quite a few, there are a few scores that are really low, and that kind of brings the average down. But if you look at the distribution of scores, the median score is actually an 89, which is, when you have skewed data, the median is actually a better indicator of the central tendency than the mean. So that is an excellent job. You, for the most part, the entire class did a fantastic job on the exam. In fact, the highest score was 100, which means there is no curve. I'm going to throw a couple points back at everybody because of the way that Canvas treats those multiple answer questions. If you get one right and you get the other one wrong, they cancel each other out. Now, to some extent, this makes sense because if you just gave points for the correct answer, you could select all wrong answers and get full points. Or select all the answers, including the wrong ones, and get full points. So you do have to have them counting off in some way. In my in-person classes, what I usually do is have wrong answers count for -half instead of minus a whole question, so that if you choose a right one and a wrong one, you still get half of the points of the right one that you chose. So you still get something. But in this case, Canvas doesn't let me do that. So I'll just give everybody a couple points to account for those kinds of things. And that includes you, 100% person. You'll end up with like 101 or something like that. That's fine. But great job. So what I usually like to do after every exam is go through and look at questions that over half the class missed. When over half the class misses a question, it means that it's not so much that you didn't do a good job studying, it's more like I didn't do a good job of teaching it to you. So I like to give you points for these and then go back and go over them. Well, guess what? There were no questions that over half the class missed, so that is excellent. It makes me feel good about my job. It makes me feel good about how you guys are studying and learning, so good. We all did a great job. There were two questions that I wanted to talk about, though. So most people got them right, but there was enough people that got them wrong that I want to clarify the points. So the first one is Reggie understood his brother's call. There's two things that you're looking for here. And everybody, 94% of you, knew that it was a substitution because it's Reggie understood, but then he pronounces it as Wedgie understood. So substitution. He's substituting a W for an R. Okay, excellent. But only about 35 or 37% of you got that there was also an omission. The omission is in understood, and this kid is pronouncing it as understood. There's no S, so he's omitting the S in understood. Now, I think what's going on there is not necessarily that you didn't know that. I think it's just that you didn't see it in there. The W's are so obvious that everybody got that right. And the missing S is right next to one of the W's, so I think it's kind of like you didn't see it. And 37% of you happened to catch it. So, I think that's what's going on. I feel like a good percentage of you actually would have known that if you had seen it, but you didn't all see it. Okay, and then the other thing I want to talk about is the yellow fever question. A lot of people said that the yellow fever experiment was unethical because people were exposed to yellow fever without knowing it, and that's not true. They did know that they could get sick with yellow fever, but they were offered $20,000 and a house. In today's currency, that's probably akin to like $80,000 to $100,000 and a house. And I mean, think of yellow fever is more like a lot deadlier than coronavirus, so I can't make a comparison there. I'm trying to think of what a good disease that we know of. I don't know. Meningitis, right? This is the one you hear about all the time, like somebody sniffs water up their nose and there's an amoeba in there and starts eating your brain. Meningitis. So let's say that I'm not sure if there's meningitis in this house. There might be. But I'll give you $100,000 and you get to keep the house, and I'm just going to see if you end up dying from meningitis. Well, so some people might take that because if they're like living on the street, $100,000 in a house is a really good trade for you might get meningitis. I mean, maybe they get meningitis, maybe they don't. And even if they do, maybe they survive. But maybe they don't. And so it enters this realm of that's a coercive payment. For somebody who is in a bad enough situation that they would risk their life for this kind of payment, that becomes a coercive payment. The yellow fever, if you're thinking of these like Hallmark unethical studies, the yellow fever experiment and the Tuskegee syphilis one, the yellow fever experiment is like by far the better one in terms of human rights violations. You could come up with a way that the yellow fever experiment is not unethical. If you're thinking about, like, yes, to the participant, it is. Hey, here's $100,000. Do you want Like, and there's a 50% chance that you're going to die, and I want to do this so I can figure out if it's caused by this pathogen. That's pretty unethical when you're on the realm of one person. But when you're thinking on the realm of like the entire human race, and also the yellow fever impacts other mammals as well, so it could affect, economics, it could affect food, and also lives. So if you're looking at as a whole, you could make an argument that it is more ethical. One thing that the UK is doing right now is trying to get an okay to actually expose people who have had the coronavirus vaccine to coronavirus and gauge 100% in a controlled environment the effectiveness of the vaccine. We know that the vaccines are effective, but we don't have good data in a controlled situation because it's unethical. What we're doing right now is we just look at the data coming back from people who have the vaccine. So like, oh, you have the vaccine, you've been to all these areas, like parties and stuff like that, and you're okay, you didn't get coronavirus, so it looks like the vaccine is working. Versus another person who didn't get the vaccine who went to the same place and did end up getting coronavirus. So we can infer that the vaccine is working. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they were always exposed, even though they were in pretty much the same conditions. You can only do that in a really controlled laboratory setting. And what's slowing this down is the ethical concerns. Can you really knowingly expose someone to a pathogen that could kill them? And when you're talking about a single person, that does seem a little unethical. But when you're talking about, survival of the species, we don't want this to mutate further than it is, then it's less unethical. It's a big, kind of a philosophical question, basically, at that point. Now, we'll switch over to the Tuskegee syphilis study. There's no way that you can make an argument for that being ethical. There's nothing. I mean, you could change everything about the study and say that they didn't just single out one racial group, which they did, so that's wrong. They didn't do it without people's consent or knowledge. If you change that, it would be a little bit better. But guess what? That didn't happen. They did it without people's consent or knowledge. So there's 2 strikes against it. And they stopped the study once there is an effective treatment for the disease. Well, they didn't do that either. So there's 3 strikes against it. And they prevented these people from getting medical care. So there's 4 strikes against it. There's no argument. There's no argument to make it ethical at all. So, but the yellow fever, you could. But that was a coercive payment, not without their knowledge. The without their knowledge one is the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, and that's probably one of the worst experiments that we know about in the United States. Although MKUltra is pretty close. If you don't know about that one, get on Google. It's pretty crazy. We don't know a lot about it. Hasn't been completely... Anyway, check it out if you're interested in some strange reading. Okay, once again, excellent job on the exam, and great job on homework 1, too. Hopefully homework 2 and exam 2 go just as well, but I have no reason to think they won't. You guys seem very capable. So I'm looking forward to reading your homework 2s, and I will talk to you soon.